these two leaders side by side, and in a moment, they will be face to face across a conference table at that villa in Geneva. This is a moment of extremely high tension. Both leaders saying the U.S.-Russian relationship is at a low point and setting very low expectations for what could be achieved, but the stakes are very high. NBC's Lester Holt in Geneva for us. Lester, good morning to you.
Savannah, good morning. Things appear to be on time right now. The Swiss president delivering remarks, kind of welcome remarks in French before. We'll let you hear a little bit of it.
I would like to welcome you to Geneva, the city of peace. It is an honor and a pleasure for Switzerland to host you here for this summit, and in accordance with its tradition of good officers, promote dialogue and mutual understanding. I wish you both presidents a fruitful dialogue in the interest of your two countries and the world. Best wishes and goodbye.
Now the hard part begins as the two leaders will go into that Villa Lagrange in Geneva and start the business of this meeting. This first meeting is going to be a small one. It will just be the two presidents and their longtime aides. The foreign minister on the Russian side and the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, will be representing the U.S., and then it will expand a little bit later to a larger working group. And I think we just saw a handshake between the two leaders. This is not their first meeting, and for neither of them is this their first rodeo, Lester. They have a lot of experience in foreign policy and this kind of summit diplomacy.
Yeah, President Biden met with President Putin back in 2011 when he was vice president. So they have, some relationship. There have been phone calls that have been exchanged since President Biden took office. But this obviously their first face-to-face meeting as two commanders in chief, if you will. We can tell you there were questions that were shouted at President Putin as he went in. Can you reach an agreement? What do you hope to accomplish? Do you trust President Biden? President Putin did not answer any of those questions. And as we anticipated after the welcome remarks, there were to be no comments from either leader. They'll now go inside. As you mentioned, they'll be with their chief diplomats, respectively. There will be what we in the news business call a pool spray. In other words, the cameras will be allowed in to capture just what's happening in the room at that moment. That'll last probably a minute or two before the cameras are ushered out and they get down to the hard work of these discussions. We've talked about 4 to 5 hours, perhaps. If it goes longer than that, that would certainly raise a sense of optimism that they were making some progress on issues. But of course, we'll have to wait and see. Savannah?
All right, Lester, hang tight there as we turn to our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander, who's been traveling with the president. Let's talk Turkey about what can actually be accomplished here. You have issues of Russian aggression in the region with Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea. You have the issue of what has happened in Syria. You have the cyber attacks with the U.S. believing that Russia is harboring those cyber criminals, and of course, election meddling. How do you think this will all play out as this agenda unfolds today?
Well, Savannah, you noted this, but White House officials acknowledge that expectations are low for today. Just yesterday, senior officials telling us that they did not expect any concrete policy announcements to come out of the day. They said if there were any agreements or any potential for agreement, it's likely that the presidents would task some of their aides, their advisors, to try to pursue it going forward. But just as we get started on this day, to pull back the curtain a little bit, you said, again, they expect it to be roughly 4 to 5 hours in there. These two leaders will not be sharing any meals together. It starts with just that two-on-two, as it were. The Secretary of State with the president on the U.S. side, the foreign minister with President Putin on the Russian side, before they invite in some other officials with them as well. One thing that struck me as we get this day started is that obviously experts say that Vladimir Putin is someone that you got to watch for the gamesmanship, the whataboutism. In 2012 at the G20 in Los Cabos, Mexico, Putin made President Obama, then President Obama, wait for 40 minutes for their meeting to take place. Today, Putin arrived here first, all of this having been negotiated. And after the U.S. saw that he was on the ground, it was 6 more minutes before the president even left his hotel to depart for this venue here. At this point, everything effectively on time. Savannah?
All right. Thank you, Peter. And just for those tuning in, we've got our eyes on Villa Lagrange in Geneva, Switzerland. It's the site of a face-to-face meeting between the Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Joe Biden. And we want to turn to NBC's Keir Simmons, because if there's anyone who knows the state of mind of Vladimir Putin recently, it's Keir, having just sat down and did an interview with him. And I was noting earlier, Keir, that to speak to Putin is in many ways an exercise in frustration. You learned that firsthand. What do you think his mindset is as he faces our president?
Well, Savannah, I think Peter Alexander is absolutely right to point out that this all seems to be going to time. I think that is a small victory for the Biden administration right there, because President Putin is notorious for being late. He is so notorious that, for example, for the German Chancellor, he was more than 4 hours late some years ago. So it is quite striking to see this all going to time. And then at the same time, just before the two leaders met, the Interfax news agency here in Russia released a series of statements from Dmitry Peskov, President Putin's spokesman, setting out what the Russians think they could agree on. It's really fascinating. So suggesting that strategic stability and arms control talks are urgently needed, and that the two presidents will decide today how to begin those talks and when to begin those talks, suggesting that the return of ambassadors, the US ambassador to here in Moscow and the Russian ambassador to Washington, could be agreed at the meeting. And then Dmitry Peskov saying that these talks will go on for as long as possible, saying, quote, that there's a vast amount to be covered, too much, in 4 to 5 hours. So, Savannah, don't be surprised if we actually do find that the talks continue longer than we had expected. And that, again, that may be a sign that there is some progress. At the same time, of course, just as with my interview with President Putin, President Biden is going in there wanting to raise issues that President Putin quite simply doesn't want to talk about. Human rights is a good example.
All right, Keir, and we want to turn now to NBC News international affairs analyst Michael McFaul, who is the former U.S. ambassador to Russia. And you have literally been in the room for meetings like this, Ambassador. So it sounds like Putin isn't playing his usual games. He showed up on time. We've seen in the past where after these meetings, he might lob a couple of surprises at the visiting president. What do you expect to come out of today?
Well, it is a good sign that he showed up on time, and that was a victory for the Biden team. They arranged that. I think Putin actually wants the headline to be, there were baby steps taken towards normalization with the United States. And that would be a giant victory for him, given all that he's done in the world over the last several years. You just mentioned strategic stability talks. If you look at the Russian delegation, they have General Gerasimov there. He's vital for strategic stability talks. They have Ambassador Antonov there. He's the gentleman that negotiated the New START treaty. Those are signs to me that they want to talk about arms control and come to some kind of agreement to begin talks. Now, that's a very low bar. I want to emphasize. To agree to talk is not much of a deliverable, but I think that's what they want to achieve in this meeting today.
And what about those who say, well, wait a minute, why are we giving that incentive to Vladimir Putin? Why should we play ball with somebody who has literally interfered with our democracy, meddling in our elections, who is turning a blind eye, according to U.S. officials, to cyber criminals in Russian territory, launching cyber attacks against American infrastructure? You know, what incentives does the U.S. have to work with someone like Vladimir Putin?
You know, we're here in Geneva where Ronald Reagan met with Mikhail Gorbachev, and Reagan's on my mind because of that. And he had a very clear strategy for dealing with the Soviets that I think is appropriate today. Engage when you can, when it's in America's national interest to engage. And on arms control, controlling nuclear weapons in the world, I think that's in America's interest. And at the same time, contain the Soviet Union or contain today Putin's belligerent behavior around the world, and don't link those two things. I think a big mistake that presidents sometimes make is they want to cooperate on arms control, and so they're quiet about human rights. They're quiet about the list that you just mentioned. I think that would be a big mistake for President Biden. Do both, engage and contain at the same time, but don't check your values at the door when you walk in to sit down with Vladimir Putin.
Step into the mind of Vladimir Putin for a moment, if you will. We know he is a dyed-in-the-wool Soviet. That's where he came from. He was a KGB operative. What is his worldview? What is his larger strategy here?
His worldview is that the United States is the enemy of Russia, that we have constructed something called the liberal international order, which maintains American hegemony in the world. And third, we use our power, overt and covert power, to overthrow regimes we don't like, including, he believes, his regime. And therefore, his strategy is to weaken the liberal international order, to weaken the United States. He sees himself in an ideological struggle with when Biden talks about democracies and autocracies, so does Putin. He sees the world in those terms, and therefore, President Biden is his chief adversary in the world today.
And let's talk about the gamesmanship, how Putin approaches these meetings. We talked a little bit earlier about his approach with reporters. We've certainly seen that technique employed over and over again. It's maddeningly frustrating, but it's hard to answer in that moment, especially via a translator when he says, "What's your proof? Show me your proof." And we've seen that technique before used to his advantage.
We have, and that's why I think it's a really smart move by the Biden team not to have a joint press conference, because when you get back and forth in that whataboutism, especially with the translator, great point, Savannah, you can not hear exactly what he said. You don't exactly know what he said, and you can make a misstep in that situation. Also, Putin is notorious for surprises. You're right. I've been in many meetings with him, and I was in the last meeting between then Vice President Biden and Prime Minister Putin. And in the press spray in that meeting, he said, out of the blue, he said, "We've just agreed to visa-free travel between our two countries," which of course was not true. Thankfully, the vice president handled that. I hope he handles other curveballs that might come his way today.
Well, and we're witnessing a moment right now. I want to bring that picture on the left full screen so we can see. This is what we call in the business of pool spray. The cameras are allowed in, rushed into the room just for the very beginning of the meeting. So we get that visual, we get that picture. Then the cameras are out and the business begins. So we have our president, Joe Biden, on one side, Vladimir Putin of the Russian Federation on the right. And for this first part of the meeting, we're only going to have those two aides, the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, who has been at Putin's side for years and years and years, and Antony Blinken, who has been at Biden's side for years and years and years. When he was U.S. Senator, Blinken was a top aide to Biden, later serving in the Obama White House, and now, of course, Secretary of State. So these are the pleasantries, such as they are, before the meeting. And I want to bring in Peter Alexander as we watch these images unfold. Talk to us, Peter, about the prep that went into this meeting, because I took note of something that you reported yesterday, that President Biden had met with many Russia advisors, some of whom had served in the Trump administration, in order, I presume, to get a wide range of perspectives on how to approach this moment.
Yes, Savannah, you're exactly right. I'm told by a person familiar with that matter that days before President Biden left the United States for Europe, he gathered with about 10 outside Russia experts in the Roosevelt Room at the White House. It was a 2-hour session where, as you say, there was a range of views discussed about how to deal with Vladimir Putin by those who had been in the room with Putin in the past. Among them, your previous guest, Ambassador McFaul, who obviously served underneath President Obama. Fiona Hill, a name that may not be familiar to many, but she's notable because she served in the National Security Council under the Trump administration, as well as Obama's administration before that, and George W. Bush as well. This conversation was focused basically on strategies going into this meeting. It was not told, but advised, among other things, that the president considered not holding a joint news conference. As a result, the White House made the decision that the two men will not speak on a shared stage together, obviously trying to erase any reminders of what happened between former President Trump and Vladimir Putin in Helsinki in 2018. As we look at this picture, I'm sort of struck by the body language between these two men and the likelihood that this is where much of the business gets done, alongside two of their top allies, their top deputies, folks that, as you note, have been with them for years. President Biden saying that he will be straight, he will be direct with Vladimir Putin to communicate with him exactly what the challenges are and what the potential consequences will be on a range of issues. And one that's been highly significant, and certainly we have seen in recent weeks so much focus on, are those ransomware attacks in the United States, with the FBI recently blaming criminal Russian hackers for targeting the U.S. oil and food, beef and pork supply in the United States. Just days before this summit, President Putin, in an interview that took place in Russia, said that he was open to swapping cyber criminals with the United States if President Biden would do the same. I asked Biden about that. He expressed an openness as well, but ultimately said it's up to those countries to hold their criminals responsible. Savannah?
All right, Peter, we'll keep our eye on these pictures as long as they're coming into us. The press in there being allowed, the international press, to take a couple of shots, still photos, video. Having been in those rooms for a time or two, it's always a bit of an awkward moment. Reporters often try to shout questions, usually without much success. I want to turn back to Ambassador McFaul. First of all, if you have any observations about the body language here, they're seated apart, I assume, as a nod to our pandemic era, although they are maskless here. And it looks like the reporters are about to be rushed out of the room, because that's what that looks like. But let's talk about, let's broaden it out a little bit. When you were with the Obama administration, it was all about the Russian reset. We want to reset relations with Russia. Then we had the Trump administration, which, to put it mildly, had a much more conciliatory tone, at least, toward Russia. We all remember that press conference in Helsinki where President Trump sided with Putin over the U.S. intelligence agencies. Where does Biden's approach fit on that spectrum? Is it a harder line?
Of course it is. I mean, we were always, back when he was vice president, remember, he was the first person that talked about the reset at the Munich Security Conference in 2009. But it was always about trying to advance American interests, win-win outcomes, good for the American people. And in those early days, remember, there was a different president, President Medvedev, and we actually did accomplish some things that were good for the American people. But when Putin came back, he had no interest in cooperating with the United States. And then, remember, there's been a lot of bad history since that period. He annexed Crimea in 2014. He intervened militarily in Syria in 2015 to prop up, I think, one of the worst dictators in the world today. He violated our sovereignty in 2016 during our elections, and then did it again in 2020. And so there's no room for a cooperative relationship, given that I think, very checkered, dramatic and very depressing history of Russian belligerent behavior over the last decade. And most certainly, President Biden understands that.
And I just want to say, it's the Biden team that requested this meeting, which is notable. Do you think there's an aspect of this that is as simple as President Biden coming in and telling Vladimir Putin, there is a new sheriff in town?
Well, I think he wants to talk about the disagreements. He's made that very clear, and Vladimir Putin's fully expecting that. He won't be surprised by that. I also think the Biden administration wants to have this meeting to kind of park in place U.S.-Russia relations. You know, they've got other things they're focused on, especially on the domestic agenda, also China, and they just don't want any more crises with Russia. And their hope is that by meeting with Putin, they're not going to settle old disagreements, but maybe they'll avoid new disagreements in the future.
All right, let me turn to Keir Simmons as we watch these images. There's a still photo just in, hot off the presses, of the two face-to-face. That's the moment the world has been waiting for. Keir Simmons is in Russia. You've been in Moscow for several weeks now. What's the feeling on the Russian street, and what does Putin have to accomplish for domestic consumption?
It's a great question, Savannah. The Russian media over the past few days has been presenting this meeting as a victory for President Putin, saying simply being seen to be invited to a meeting by President Biden like this is a positive for the Kremlin. Just to add some color, Savannah, you were mentioning about what looks like the social distancing in those shots that we just saw with President Putin and President Biden. For the interview that we conducted with President Putin, we came here to Russia 2 weeks prior, and we had to quarantine for just under 2 weeks. We had to be tested multiple times. The Russian media saying that the Putin delegation have been tested many times in order to have this meeting. So some interesting color just there.
All right, Keir, thank you so much. And that's the shot of the morning. The two leaders face to face. Now we know what it looks like in the room, but what happens in the room, well, we'll have to wait for more word on that. This meeting is expected to unfold over the course of several hours in Geneva today, starting with that core four group of leaders, but then expanding. We are expecting a press conference from Vladimir Putin, a solo press conference first, then followed by President Biden. We will have more coverage from Geneva coming up on today, also on MSNBC and NBC News Now. And again, we'll bring you live coverage of President Biden's news conference as soon as it begins. I'm Savannah Guthrie in New York. This has been an NBC News special report.